Yochanan ben Zakkai gets there. He meets someone, we'll find out in a second. He says, "Greetings to you, the king. Greetings to you, the king." And it's Vespasian. Vespasian says to him, "Well, you're liable for 2 death penalties. One, I'm not a king, and you've called me a king, so that's like treasonous to the king. Death to you. And also, if I am the king, why didn't you come to me until now? Like, you waited this long to come to me. If I'm a king, why didn't you come to me? Well, there's zealots among us, and it's all the zealots' fault, basically. We'd all be getting on fine if it wasn't for the zealots." Understanding that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was prepared to ask him not to destroy the temple, Vespasian said, "Okay, if there's a barrel of honey and a snake, and you've got is wrapped around it, wouldn't they break the barrel in order to kill the snake? In a similar fashion, I have to destroy Jerusalem, right, in order to kill the zealots. We all know it's the zealots. It's all about the zealots. But I'm sorry, we have to kill Jerusalem because otherwise we can't get at them." And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was silent. He didn't have an answer.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. We need to take a look at the Jewish world. Maybe have a little more understanding when it comes to things like the Jerusalem Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud or the Tosefta, or you name it, all these writings, why they matter, especially when I love diving into the New Testament, understanding Christian history and what's up with early Christianity, what really happened and all of that. There's a lot we should check out from the Jews themselves. And so with that being said, I brought on my good friend, Dan Jacobs. How are you?
I'm really good, thanks, Derek. How are you?
Doing good. I'm really glad that you're here joining us to teach me a little bit of what's going on with this literature, what's it about, whatever we're going to dive into. Real quick plug, if I may, I have a Patreon, and he is one of the Patreon members. In fact, this is how we connected. And also, I launched this stuff early. This video itself will be found on Patreon early access for everybody who helps support me here. So consider helping us out so you can bring more education to the world and I can keep doing what I do here at MythVision. The website we're going to be talking about specifically is the Sefaria.org, which is a really good one. And so, Dan, I'm ready when you are, but if you would, before we dive in, I think it's necessary that people know, who is this guy?
I know, who is Dan Jacobs? So I'm a Londoner based in the UK. I grew up as a traditional Jew in an Orthodox family. For many years, I was very Orthodox Jew, and now I'm what we call off the derech, which means no longer religious. And I identify as an agnostic atheist. During my time as a religious Jew, learning and studying is considered very, very important. So I became, I was sort of brought up with and went through Jewish education, very familiar with Jewish texts, and I became really interested from an academic perspective, and and who really wrote this stuff and where does it all come from. So I've self-taught, but also studied at a local Jewish academic centre here called the London School of Jewish Studies, where I did, I think, 2 or 3 year courses there. So quite in-depth study into the Talmud, the rabbis, and different things. So
I know that Christine Hayes had a debate with a rabbi over the Talmud, and he was like, "You're not reading it for what the purpose is really about. It's to learn about how to apply and the wisdom of God and things like this." And she's like, "No, she said, I'm not religious like you, but she said I read it and I get kind of a religious experience. I hope I'm not putting words in her mouth, but it's something like this. She said, I get a religious experience in the literature of learning who the rabbi was, what was he writing and why, how were they thinking? Like all of those interesting details that really a religious Jew's not reading this material for that purpose." No,
absolutely. When we're learning these texts in a yeshiva, a seminary, or in a school system or whatever, you're not looking at it from a kind of the context. I mean, some people are, but on the whole, you're not looking at it from, the context, who wrote it, why, what was their motivation, all of that kind of thing. So that's really interesting. And I think it's important to say that the academic study of the rabbinic text is nowhere near as advanced as, say, the academic study of Christian texts or Old Testament / Hebrew Bible, obviously because of numbers. Essentially, there's just a lot more people in the Christian world and the secular world who are interested in that academic pursuit. So a lot of what I'm talking about is how a religious Jew understands these texts, but also the degree to which I'm able to assess it through an academic lens. There are books and teachers available. Hopefully we can bring on to MythVision in the future. So why don't I start with the really, really basic. I actually have 4 sources on this website. You talked about Sephiria, which is a brilliant.
Let me know if you want me to pop it up.
You can pop it up now. It's basically a website that has hundreds and thousands of Jewish texts on there, and it's really well organized, and you can put together your own source sheets, which I've done for today. We
won't be getting through all of this today.
No, we won't be getting. It's a lot in there. So I put together 4 sources that I want to cover, even if we don't read them all and go into detail, because what I'm showing here is how the rabbis essentially adapted Judaism from a temple cult or a temple religion to a diaspora religion, or a religion without a central place of worship. Because historically Judaism was very much, what does Judaism mean? What's a Jew? I mean, it's someone from Judah, right? So Judaism was the religion of the land of Judah, and Jews are the people from Judah. And what do you do without that land? What do you do without the temple and the ritual sacrifice? And so the rabbis had to really, after 70, had to really quickly pivot, and they were just amazingly creative, and they blow my mind. I absolutely love this stuff.
And just so everybody can get a forecast taste of what you're going to point out, and I think this is important in our New Testament studies, is when rabbis do, and you got to love them. I mean, rabbis are funnier than all the people on earth. Usually rabbis just know how to pull a joke out. They're really, Rabbi Tovia Singer, for example. But they love lambasting Christianity and jabbing at Paul like, you stupid. But then when you really look at them, as you're kind of trying to hint here, they know how to flex and bend and reinterpret and do the most amazing things with words.
Well, I think I'm going to show you some radical things today that are absolutely central to Rabbinic Judaism. But when you look at them, they're actually quite radical. And yeah, I think you're 100% right that other religions who criticize Christianity, especially Paul, look how Paul distorted the Torah, and it's true. But then that's how we work. That's what he was doing, just what the rabbis do, The difference is that the rabbis claim to have been given the authority to do that. They claim to have been given the authority to take and twist and play with these things, and that's what we're going to look at now. So I just want to start with the first text, this is from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is written down in its final form around 220 CE, and it's the central kind of pillar of Rabbinic Judaism. The way we understand it is that there were several Mishnahs, different books, and they were kind of like the cliff notes that the rabbis had when they were teaching. So this was written down by Judah the Prince, Yehuda HaNasi, in 220, and it's understood that people before him, like Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir and other rabbis of the preceding age, also had their own Mishnahs, but this is kind of putting it all together into one. And a lot of the Mishnahs put into some kind of 6 categories, 6 orders, and then there's several books in them. One of the books is very different to the others, and that's the book we're looking at today, which is called Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot literally means paragraphs of the fathers, or sayings of the fathers. Often it's translated as ethics of our fathers, and it's kind of all it's mainly sayings, ethical sayings, and things like that. But what they do at the beginning is really important for the whole of Rabbinic Judaism. So it says Moshe Kibil Torah b'Sinai. So Moses received the Torah at Sinai. I'll just carry on in the English because it's quicker, and transmitted it to Joshua. So we know who Joshua was, and Joshua to the elders. So Joshua transmitted the Torah to the elders. The elders are the scribes and sages and etc. And the prophets. The elders then to the prophets, and then the prophets. So the prophets, we know who the prophets they're talking about. Ezekiel and Isaiah and all of these people, ending with Malachi, which is the last book of the Torah, of the Tanakh, or Daniel, which is the last written piece, according to academics. And then the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. So this is the chain of transmission. So who were the men of the Great Assembly? This is in Nehemiah. Is that how you say it in English?
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah, yeah. So Nehemiah in Hebrew. And it's so Ezra sets up this kind of court of 120 people made up of prophets and sages and scribes, and they're kind of deciding the law. And it's around for say 100 or 200 years. We don't know exactly. In fact, we're not even sure it really existed. We don't have fantastic evidence. It's all just based on that. The sources in Nehemiah. Then it gives here, just going back to the text, it gives a pithy kind of line. What did they say? The men of the Great Assembly said 3 things. Be patient in giving justice. Raise many disciples, so you need to train people in being judges, and make a fence around the Torah. So this is a big principle of Rabbinic Judaism. That means you have to protect the law. So on Shabbat, we don't cook food on Shabbat, so we have to be careful. We wouldn't even heat. I don't know. That's not a good example, but it's kind of it's kind of putting extra laws in place to protect the fundamental laws. I'll try and think of a better example.
Yeah, we see this with like maybe even cleansing, like washing of hands and things, like to make sure one doesn't become unclean. You go the extra mile and wash 18 times. Let's say like some of the rabbis may have in the first century. You see a lot of washing taking place.
Well, I'll give you a contemporary example.
Okay.
On Shabbat, you're not allowed. There's a rabbinic law or concept called muksa, which is an object you're not allowed to even touch on Shabbat. And the reason you're not allowed to touch it is because you may come to use it, and it's something you're not allowed to use on Shabbat. So let's say my mobile phone. If I was a religious Jew, I shouldn't use my mobile phone on Shabbat. That's a whole other 2 hours conversation. Why? But it does always lead back to the Torah. And so you shouldn't even touch it. You shouldn't even move it in case you come to use it. And that's putting a fence around the Torah, or at least a modern understanding of that. So we're just going to keep going through the text. So you've got the men of the Great Assembly, and then now it starts listing individual people, and then pairs, and then more individual people, and giving you their sayings. So we're going to just go through. So we're not going to go read them all, but Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon or Simon the Righteous, was one of the last of the Great Assembly. Here's what he said, etc. And now the next one, verse 1-3, Antigonus from Socho, a place, he got the tradition from Simon the Righteous, and he used to say X, Y, Z. There's some amazing sayings in here. Some of them are brilliant. And now if you go to the next one, you start seeing Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan, they of Jerusalem, and they used to say, and it keeps doing this, so we're not going to go through the whole text. It keeps doing it. Now, I want to flip over, Derek, to the timeline that I gave you.
Okay, let me grab that real quick.
Because we can see on the timeline, what it's actually doing is, it's the timeline's not on that document. It's a Google spreadsheet that I also sent you a link to, so you may have to.
Okay, hold on one second. Let me get that up.
So while
Did
you're
you
doing
actually
that,
send that to me? You already emailed it to me, or you the one you?
I sent it as a link on WhatsApp, but I'll send it to you again.
I found it.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So while you're bringing that up, there's a really important question here. What do they mean by Torah? What do they mean by tradition? When they're passing this stuff down, what does it mean? Yeah, this is what I want to show. So what does it mean? It actually, the Jewish tradition is that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he received the Torah, but the Torah is not just the Pentateuch or the Tanakh. It's also the entire oral Torah and everything that's ever going to come from the oral Torah. And the oral Torah is what the Mishnah is, and the Mishnah is, written down in 220. And when you read the Mishnah, it's kind of like some of its conversations, some of its stories, a lot of it's very contemporary of its time. And it's like, how could Moses have received that? It's kind of about people that are living 1,500 years after him. But that's the belief, is that, so I've kind of put this timeline together. It's, if you look at the dating, to keep it simple, I put sort of end dates. So you've got Moses first there, and then you've got him giving the tradition to Joshua, and then the elders get it, so they're judges and kings, the prophets, and then you've got this great assembly which was founded by Ezra. Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, who is, or the righteous, who, and you can see the dates, we're starting to get into a kind of more sort of almost at the Christian era. And then you've got what we call the Zugot, which are pairs. Now, the Zugot were the sort of really recognized as the first, these are Pharisees, right? And some of them are mentioned, like you've got at the end Hillel and Shammai. These are mentioned, and some of the others are mentioned in like Josephus and in other places. So we know that they are probably historical figures, at least some of them were. The pairs, there were two roles to the pairs. You have, the first one is the Nasi, which is the prince. And the Nasi led the Great Assembly, would have led the follow-up to the Great Assembly, which is the Sanhedrin. So we know about the Sanhedrin from Acts because Paul gets dragged there and gets in trouble, and then he gets defended by the Pharisees, right? So the Nasi, the prince, is in charge of the Sanhedrin. And there's a second role, Av Beit Din, which is the father of or the head of the rabbinic court, and they are the assistant to the Nasi. So that's what these pairs are. So interestingly, when you go down and you can see this is going through kind of the Maccabean period or the Hasmonean period into the Roman period. When you go down to Hillel and Shammai, they're two really famous Zugot and kind of seen as really sort of maybe the first rabbis, but there's no real line. Actually, interestingly, if you scroll across a little bit, the first so the first pair, instead of Hillel and Shammai, it was actually Hillel and Menachem the Essene. So Menachem the Essene was the assistant to Hillel. And so it's really interesting that there was, it's recorded that there was an Essene who was in the Sanhedrin, and he was, part of this whole process. I'm just bringing that out here. So you can see how it all starts to tie together in the world we live in. Then you get, and we'll come back to the texts in a minute, you get the Tanaim, and these are the, what we consider to be the rabbis of the Mishnaic period, so the period of the Mishnah. So they start with sort of Hillel and Shammai, who are a kind of crossover, and it ends with Judah the Prince, who's the guy that writes down the Mishnah. And some of these names you'll be familiar with, or at least one of them you're familiar with, because you've got Gamliel in there,
right?
So Gamliel Hazaken, the elder or the old. So he was maybe Paul's teacher, if we believe that that's true. Don't know. And so he was part of this tradition. And what's really cool is that from the time of Hillel all the way until the 9th century, this role of the Nasi, the prince, was hereditary. So all of these people underneath, like Shimon bar Hillel, and then Gamliel, and then Shimon ben Gamliel, and all of these people, or the head, at least the Nasi in each period, was a descendant, like a blood son of the previous. So it's really long dynasty here. It's like probably one of the longest in the world. Although they didn't have like political power, they were in charge of. They had a lot of power. So then I think without continuing to go through everything, let's go back to the text. Otherwise, we're not going to have time. I know I'm throwing lots of information, everyone, today, so hopefully we can dive deeper into some of it another time. So if we scroll down, just if we keep going down to the end of the Pirkei Avot section, hopefully it's kind of delineated. And if you could, I'm sure you'll share the link in the description, but it's like reading some of this stuff is really cool. There's like some really interesting stories associated with each of them. Is there an intro? Yes, there is. So there's a bit of intro I've written. So go up a little bit.
This one up here is.
So that's the previous one. Okay.
Yeah.
What we're doing is. I think this one is from the Babylonian Talmud. So there's two Talmuds, which you've mentioned a few times on the channel. So you've got the Mishnah, which is redacted in 220. About 200 years, over the next sort of 150 years, the rabbis continue to sort of adapt or sort of commentate on the Mishnah. And it becomes, so they literally are like writing a commentary on the Mishnah, and that is, we call it Gemara, and that makes up, the two together make up the Talmud. And that's the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud, they're interchangeable names. But the Jews would not have been living in Jerusalem, so they're obviously trying to attach it to the importance of Jerusalem. So that Sanhedrin and the center of Judaism moves from Jerusalem because of the destruction of the temple, and then obviously with the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it first of all, it ends up in a place called Yavna, which is sort of the south of Israel, and then it moves to the Galilee, where the Sanhedrin is, until it ends in the 4th century and no longer exists. And this story, which I'm going to go through from the, or at least some of it, from the Talmud in Gittin, which is a book of the Talmud, shows how they managed to get out of Jerusalem and basically set up the rabbinic academies. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud, which is then picked up in sort of modern day Iraq. There are Jewish academies there. In the 5th, sort of 4th, 5th, and 6th century, that's where the center of rabbinic thinking is. It's moved away from the land of Israel because the Jews there really don't have any power, and there's no. So many have had to leave, and it's not a welcoming place anymore. And that's where the new Babylonian Talmud, which is kind of the most important Talmud for Jews today, is put together over a period of several hundred years. So I'm just going to read some of this. Let me put it on my screen so I'm not squinting. Do you have any questions while I'm pulling this up?
No, I think this is really interesting. I mean, one of them I do is how reliable is a lot of this material. You know, it's one of those things, because I would love to say some of this is reliable, but to glean historical nuggets, you know.
It's like, how reliable are the Gospels? It's the same kind of question. It's really hard to get into, again, like when they're writing stories, we should give a bit of background. So this is a midrash in the Talmud. We talk about midrash. The word comes up on MythVision a lot. Midrash comes from the word drush, which is basically a story. And they are not supposed to be historical truth or literal truth in the way we, modern people understand it. They are stories which may have kernels of truth, but they are to teach us something. And the Talmud, especially the Babylonian Talmud, but the Mishnah and both Talmuds have Midrash in there. There's two types of Midrash. There's Midrash Halacha and Midrash Agadah. Midrash Halacha are stories that are supposed to help you understand the law and often relate back to the Torah. And there are lots of, as well as being in the Mishnah and Talmud, there's lots of books of Midrash Halacha, like Sifra and Sifrei, which are midrashic exegesis of I think it's Exodus and Leviticus, off the top of my head. And then there's Midrash Agadah, which are kind of more moralistic stories that are not supposed to necessarily either attached to the Torah or learning the law, but are about learning principles or ethics and that kind of thing. So we're looking here, this is an Agadic story, so not a legal story. And it says that the Gemara relates, so the Gemara is the commentary on the Mishnah in the Talmud. Abba Sikra was the leader of the Zealots of Jerusalem. So we know the Zealots of Jerusalem were these this group in Jerusalem that went around wanting to agitate for a fight, right? And the rabbis do not like them. They talk negatively about them in the Talmud, so they don't like them. They're seen as kind of why, the reason why Jerusalem was destroyed. If we hadn't bothered the Romans so much, we could have just placated them a bit more, maybe. So he's the leader of the Zealots, and he's the son of the sister of Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's on our timeline we saw earlier. Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the rabbinic leaders of the time. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabban being an Aramaic sort of version of rabbi. There's so much to say. Like this is all written in Aramaic. The Mishnah is Hebrew, and the Talmud is Aramaic. So the rabbi sends a message, come to meet me in secret. He came. Rabban Yochanan said to him, until when are you gonna be enough with this? When's enough? You're gonna kill us all through starvation? So they're in the siege in Jerusalem, and Yochanan ben Zakkai is challenging the leader of the Zealots. What are you doing? You're crazy. We're all gonna die. You're gonna die of starvation. And he said, what can I do? For if I try and stop it, they're going to kill me. I'm not the bad one. It's the other Zealots. They're, blame them. Yochanan ben Zakkai said, so let me leave the city. Give me a way of leaving the city, so at least there's some salvation. Interesting word, salvation. So we carry on. So the Zealots leader said to him, okay, pretend you're ill, and everyone will ask, how are you doing? And the word will spread so everyone will know that you're really ill. And afterwards, bring something that really stinks and put it near you so people think you've died and that you're decomposing. And then have your students come to take you to a burial. And no one else will, in the Zealots, they won't know. There's this whole thing about the body being light, but let's not go into that. They thought the body got lighter when you died. Probably like the soul is quite heavy or something, I don't know. There you go. As the Zealots know that a living person is lighter than the dead person. Good science. So we're carrying on Gittin 56a 17. So he did it, right? And Rabbi Eliezer, very important student who's very big in the Mishnah, and Rabbi Yeshua, another similar one. They took him either side. They went to the entrance to the city of Jerusalem, and they went past the guards, the Zealot guards, and they wanted to pierce his body to make sure he's actually dead. Apparently it was a common practice. And the leader of the Zealots, Abba Sikara, said to them, by the way, Sikara is...
Sikari.
Sikari, yeah, Sikari. Now, it's probably obviously not a real name. The Sikari were those... who had these sharp knives that they would stab people with, right? So that's a very sort of rabbinic thing. They kind of just use.
There is this idea that
obvious.
Judas Iscariot is a garbled term for Sikari.
Yeah. Would have been probably a bit earlier. I don't know, because for me the Sicarii were around the Jewish wars, which mainly was like in the 60s. But it could have been an earlier idea. I don't know.
Well, I mean, in the Gospels, I definitely, and most of the critical scholars I talk to, think that they're written post-war, so they would have already known this idea.
So it's just an anachronism, yeah.
Right.
Anachronism, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the Romans will say, "Oh, they pierce even their teacher," and the guards wanted to push him to see if he's still alive, and he'll cry out. And the Abba Sikara said to them, and they're gonna, anyway, there's a lot of repetition. Anyway, but he said, "Oh, they're going to push you." In other words, he's saying the Romans will say you don't respect your teacher, the rabbi, if you're going to stab him and you're going to push him. So don't do that. So it's so he manages to get out, opens the gate, and he's taken out. Yochanan ben Zakkai gets there, and he meets someone. We'll find out in a second. He says, "Greetings to you, the king. Greetings to you, the king." And it's Vespasian. Vespasian says to him, "Well, you're liable for 2 death penalties. One, I'm not a king, and you've called me a king, so that's like treasonous to the king. Death to you. And also, if I am the king, why didn't you come to me until now? Like, you waited this long to come to me." And he says, "In truth, you are a king." I'm just skipping down to B1. "If you're not a king, Jerusalem would not be handed over to you." In other words, you're not going to get Jerusalem, because it's written, "And the Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one, and mighty one." So this is from Isaiah, and he's doing some exegesis on this. And mighty one only means a king, as it is written from a completely different source, unrelated. Good rabbinical work here. "And their mighty one shall be of themselves." So for me, that means you're a king. You're going to be a king. And Lebanon means the temple, as it is stated somewhere completely different and not connected. That good mountain and the Lebanon. So the good mountain and the Lebanon. This is completely out of context, but this is what rabbis do. So maybe we shouldn't be so critical to Paul, right? So he's basically using these these quotes as text to say, "I'm prophesizing based on these texts. You have to be a king. You have to be." As for your second comment, if I'm a king, why didn't you come to me? Well, there's zealots among us, and it's all the zealots' fault, basically. We'd all be getting on fine if it wasn't for the zealots. So there's a lot of anti-zealot in lots of places in the Talmud. So moving on, 56b2. And this is, I should say, when we're looking at this text, the bit that's not bolded is kind of interpolation by the person translating it. So it's to try and make it easier to read, because the Talmud is not easy to read. So understanding that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was prepared to ask him not to destroy the temple. So this is all assumed, but it's actually in the text. It is in the text, but he's sort of rewriting it to make it easier. Vespasian said, "Okay, if there's a barrel of honey and a snake, you've got is wrapped around it, wouldn't they break the barrel in order to kill the snake? In a similar fashion, I have to destroy Jerusalem, right, in order to kill the zealots. We all know it's the zealots. It's all about the zealots. But I'm sorry, we have to kill Jerusalem because otherwise we can't get at them." And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was silent. He didn't have an answer. And then he gets castigated. There's a little bit here, something. He's kind of gets called foolish man by a later rabbi. But let's skip that bit because he kind of basically is allowing Jerusalem to be destroyed. So moving on, as Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai should have said to Vespasian in response, in such a case, we'll just use tongs. You can use precision weaponry to remove the zealots. We'll just use a laser guided bomb and take it that way. You didn't have to destroy the barrel, the Jerusalem as well. There's a lot of like metaphor and imagery used in the Talmud. So just the next one, 56b3. In the meantime, as they're talking, a messenger By the way, when it's got in brackets, it's got Ferratiska. That's what they're doing is showing wordplay, but I'm not going to go into that. There's a lot of wordplay and rhyme and stuff and dual meanings. But obviously, you can study this text for a year. You know. In the meantime, messenger comes from Rome and said to him, "Rise, for the emperor has died, and the noblemen of Rome plan to appoint you as their leader and make you the next emperor." And at that time, Vespasian was wearing only one shoe. When he tried to put on the other one, it wouldn't go on his foot. I think your feet grow when you become king or something. So he said, so we'll just move on to 4. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Be not distressed, for good tidings have reached you. As it is written, good tidings make the bone fat, and your feet have grown fatter out of joy and satisfaction." But what's the remedy, asked Vespasian. And Rabbi Yochanan says, "Well, have someone who you're unhappy with pass before you, because as it's written." So he's showing his mastery of the text here. You know, a broken spirit dries the bones. So he did this, and the shoe went on his foot. Now, people, you know, rabbis will spend decades writing commentaries about what all that means. You know, why that's in there, what that's got to do with the story, and what we need to learn from it. So Vespasian said, "Since you're so wise and you didn't come and see me, and you know, should have told me." Let's just move on. And 56b5. Vespasian said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, "I will be going to Rome to accept my new position, and I'll send someone else in my place to continue besieging the city and waging war against it. But before I leave, ask me anything, and I'll give it to you." And Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Give me Yavna and its sages, and do not destroy it, and spare the dynasty of Rabban Gamliel. So, and do not kill them as if they're the rebels." So this is the really critical bit. He's not saying, "Do me a favor, just don't destroy the temple. When you get in there, don't destroy the temple." Why not? Because this is all written afterwards anyway. He couldn't, you know, the temple's destroyed. But what he's saying is, so give us this academy in Yavna, that's what they set up there, and the sages, the rabbis there, give them like protection. And there was we know historically there was a Roman garrison in Yavna, so it would have been a protected place. They all would have been told to be okay with these guys. And that's all I'm asking for. And then there's a bit about healing Rabbi Zadok. We're not going to go into that. And let's move on. Is there anything else we should say? And what? So number 6, 56b6. And why didn't Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai make the request? Which I think is to do with saving Jerusalem. He maintained that Vespasian wouldn't do that much for him. There would not even be a small amount of salvation. So he'll just say, "No, I'm not saving Jerusalem. I'm not going to give you that. So it's not going to happen." So therefore, he just made a small request. That's how they are able to, you know, justify this situation, allowing Jerusalem to be destroyed. And then at the end, it says, you know, Vespasian went back to Rome and sent Titus in his place. So we know there's some history here, right? You know, this stuff happened. And the Gemara, that's this commentary, cites a verse referring to Titus, "And he shall say, where is their God, their rock in whom they trusted? This is the wicked Titus who insulted and blasphemed God on high. Titus destroys the temple." So that is the Midrash. And I think it's just incredible. It's like, if you put it together with the Mishnah we looked at before, you've got the beginnings, the very beginnings of how the rabbis started to get their head around, understand, and adapt to the temple being destroyed. We've got this chain of tradition in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the oral Torah. The oral Torah was given at Mount Sinai with to Moses with the written Torah. So that lineage was always there. It's always established. It was always supposed to be. And so it's really important we save that lineage. It's really important that the rabbis get to be given Yavna and to be allowed to have their academy there and continue running a Sanhedrin there, the court, the high court, Supreme Court, right? Right. Because that is Torah. And without the temple, the Torah is the most important thing. So
this makes me want to ask so many questions, of course, and like critical historians or people who are really getting to the bottom of this. When do they say is this an origin myth to suppose that there was really this tradition? And when would we say?
So the chain of transmission in the Mishnah, we don't know exactly when that came up, but you can, by reading it, by looking at it, you can have a pretty good idea. The rabbis obviously created it. Mm-hmm. It may have been a tradition that the Pharisees created, because it starts with Pharisaic names, like Hillel and people like that, and just the people of that generation. That's where, when you look at that Mishnah, the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, that's where, for example, there are no sayings until you come to the men of the Great Assembly, right? The men of the Great, and then there's one saying attributed to them, which we read. And then when you get into the Zugot, these pairs of rabbis who are more Pharisees, if you can distinguish, that's when they start getting lots of traditions attributed to them. So I think it's somewhere in the kind of first century BCE, first century CE period is when that kind of tradition of authority is. And this whole smuggling Yochanan ben Zakkai out of Jerusalem and giving him Yavna, that is definitely later. I mean, it's in both Talmuds, so the earliest it could be is the 300, so the 4th century sometime. When
they're in Yavna and actually settled there, right? Well,
they've moved to the Galilee after. They didn't stay in Yavna for that long, probably because that part of Israel became very hostile with the Bar Kokhba revolt and things. Okay. But what's interesting, we don't have time to do it today, but you and I have talked about this before, is there's a similar story in Josephus where he talks about himself essentially meeting Vespasian. He's hauled up, hiding from the Romans with his garrison. They all kill themselves. Josephus is the last one of his garrison left standing. He gets captured by Vespasian. He quotes some of the same sources that we see in this, and the Vespasian basically says, okay, you can come and live with me. You're part of the Flavius family now. So there's a parallel there, and definitely there's similar. And we can maybe look at do a textual analysis of the two together. So yes. For me, this is lifted from there and turned into an origin story for the sages of Yavna. So I'm aware of the time. And I know we're going to try and keep this to an hour today, but I'd like to briefly look at the next two sources because they're really cool. And the next one we've got is by a teacher of mine. He calls it the Back to the Future Gemara. Again, the word Gemara that's the commentary on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah and Gemara together is the Talmud. So this is another Agadata, so a midrashic story, also in the Babylonian Talmud. And in this story, it's basically how Moses is confused because he doesn't understand. Well, let's just go through it, because rather than explaining it, and I've shortened it actually, so I've kind of pulled bits out and shortened it. So Rabbi Yehuda, so this is they're quoting again, this is Babylonian Talmud, sort of 5th, 6th, 7th century, because it was edited over a long period of time. It's hard to know exactly what was written then, but they're calling back to Rabbi Yehuda, who is a Mishnaic rabbi. So going back to that Mishnaic period of 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd century CE. Rabbi Yehuda said, Rav said, so he's quoting another, but this happens a lot. This person said that this person said that this person said. When Moses ascended to the heavens, so this happened, apparently, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and attaching crowns to the letters. So when you look at a Torah, you'll see there's crowns on the letters. We don't really know what they mean now. He said to him, Master of the universe. He's not He-Man. It's just one of the names for God. Master of the universe, who is staying your hand? He said to him, so who's like getting you to attach these crowns? And he says, there's one man who exists in many generations in the future. His name's Akiva, the son of Yosef, who will in the future expound on every crown and crown piles and piles of laws. So what he's saying is Rabbi Akiva, who's a very famous Mishnah rabbi, really important. He had probably his own Mishnah, which was then became part of the Mishnah we have now. There's many amazing stories about him. He would derive laws from the crowns, not just the words in the Torah and the sentences, but even the crowns. There were two rabbis. He had a kind of adversary, Rabbi Ishmael, who was very much, we kind of do what it says on the tin. We do what it says in the Torah. We don't. And Rabbi Akiva was much more like, no. Like he was like, read into everything. So this is kind of like, how could Rabbi Akiva do that, you know? And so he said so Moses says to God, Master of the universe, show me this guy. I want to see him, right? So turn backwards. This is the Back to the Future bit. This is where Moses gets in a DeLorean, hits 88 miles per hour, and then he finds himself at the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom, his Beit Midrash, his house of learning, right? So he went and sat at the end of the 8th road. That's like the back where the thickies sit, the idiots, right? Because the way it would work is the clever ones would be at the front and the stupid ones at the back. So it's really showing Moses had no idea what was going on here. And he didn't know what they were talking about. He had no idea. He got upset. And as soon as Rabbi Akiva got to like one thing or another thing, his student said, our teacher, from where did you learn this? So this is Rabbi Akiva's student saying, where did you learn this? He said, it's the law that was taught to Moses at Sinai. Right?
Right.
Interesting.
Right. And here's Moses not knowing what,
and not knowing what's going on. But it's interesting because there's this idea that the entire oral Torah, including whatever Rabbi Akiva is learning from the crowns on the letters of in the Torah, was given at Sinai. So Moses calms down and he returns. He got back in his DeLorean and he came back to God and he said, Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the universe, you have a man like this and you're giving the Torah to me. Why would you give the Torah to me, right? I'm an idiot compared to this guy. And he said to him, shut up. This is what I've decided. So God's like, I don't need to tell you why. Like, this is just how it works. This is it. And he said to him, Master of the universe, you show me his Torah, show me his reward. So he goes back into his DeLorean and he ends up in the Roman times. Now, there's unfortunately a really nasty midrash about several midrashim stories about how Rabbi Akiva was killed by the Romans and they flailed him, they burnt him alive, and in the end he's tortured, etc. So Moses sees this, he turns backwards and he saw that they were tearing his skin with iron combs. And Moses says to God, Master of the universe, and I'll tell you what he says in Aramaic or Hebrew, it's Zu Torah v'Zu Schara. This is Torah and this is the reward. Like, this is a man of Torah. Like, this amazing learning, and he's learning all these things out that you gave to me, but I obviously passed on, but I somehow didn't understand, and now he's teaching it, and this is what the law is, and this is what you do to him. And God's like, shut up, this is it. There's a real kind of what's the word that used about Calvinism? Determinism here. Right. Like a determinism. It's like, this is just it. I'm not going to give you the reasons why. This is just it. Don't question me. So anyway, it's a brilliant story that ties together with the two previous things, the sources that we've looked at, because it's showing the extent to which the rabbis are given authority, and Rabbi Akiva is going, I'm going to learn out what I'm going to learn out from this, from the crowns on there, and that's it. And Moses looks at it and he's confused, and God's like, that's it, this is it. I don't need to explain to you. This is the score. Yeah.
There's a couple of things that I'm picking up in this, in my opinion. I could be wrong. Seems like they had a lot of time to look over these same things and to come up with clever ways of like teaching something. Number one, Moses doesn't get it, which might mean the way they're viewing the text is it's alive. kind of like what we see in the New Testament when people love to pick at Christianity, and sure, I do it too, to point out they're reinterpreting the text for Jesus. Oh, this is talking about him. He's talking about him. I imagine they would have done this for Rabbi Akiva or whoever in the situation, reinterpreting the text to apply to a certain rabbi or to apply to a certain teacher or a certain issue that's going on. And its original context has nothing to do with that issue. So here is Moses, doesn't get it, is blown away. Like, everything you handed to me, I only got like this much of it. Everyone else is seeing the depths that this is.
Not only that, why are you giving the Torah to me? Like, why didn't you wait for Rabbi Akiva? Or, like, this guy's the bomb. He knows what he's talking about. Like, he really gets it. Why, and God could have said, well, you needed to be now, and you were the person of your generation, and
right.
It had to be so that the Jews, could reach the land of Israel, or the Israelites could reach the land of Israel, and it could have, but it's like, no, just shut up, like literally shut up.
It also makes me think of the kind of torture that he went through. This might get into some type of theology in a suffering servant type mentality. That I wonder. So
there's a whole thing we can do another time of suffering rabbis. So there's this kind of idea in Judaism, we don't have the suffering servant. We don't have this guy who suffers. Like, suffering's not good. It's not seen as a good thing. And then there are these people that do suffer, like Rabbi Akiva, but there's a brilliant one called a guy in the Mishnah period called Nachum of Gamzu. Nathan, is he Nachum or Natan? Anyway, of Gamzu. So the place he's from is called Gamzu, but it's also a pun. Because he's a bit of like a rabbinic Job, right? He says, if he challenges God to kind of like remove his limbs and all sorts of things, and he's like going through all this suffering, and every time it happens to him, he's like Gamzu Latova, which means that's all for the best. It's what God wants. It's fine. And it's a very kind of Jobian, and he's not the only character. So there is a kind of idea of suffering being a positive thing, but it's not the mainstream rabbinic ideology. It's kind of a minor thread that goes through. It's not really what we're looking for, suffering, but it does exist.
I was wondering, just looking at that passage at the end where he talks about Master of the Universe, such Torah and such reward. He said to him, "Be silent." This is Yeah, I didn't know, and I was thinking of like this guy's Torah, like Moses is saying to God, this is a great Torah, this Torah beyond what he knows of, such a reward. And what I was thinking is like, when you're that learned and you have that much wisdom in this, is this the kind of reward you get? Like, is it wise people will suffer? I didn't know if that's.
You could read it that way, but I don't think that's what's intended. I think it's a different message here, which is basically we can have this relationship, you and I, but I'm God. Yeah. Now you're asking me these questions, but don't forget I'm God, so I don't actually have to answer anything.
This is like Paul in Romans chapter 9 when they ask him, how can God find any fault with everybody since he's the one causing it all? And he's like, who do you think you are? Does the man say to its maker, why have you made me thus? He's like, shut up. God does what he wants with the clay. He makes some vessels for wrath, some vessels for glory. Get over it. He does what this rabbi you're describing is obviously trying to convey.
So let's just quickly do the last one, because for me, this is like the cherry. This is like explosion. When you put Mentos into a Coca-Cola thing and it just explodes. So this is a halachic midrash. So it's a midrash which is about Jewish law. And there's a big argument here. Again, it's also in the Babylonian Talmud, but it's talking about Mishnaic rabbis and rabbis of the Mishnah periods. And there's a big argument between Rabbi Eliezer, who was the leading rabbi at the time. There's a lot of interesting stories about him and what happens to him. And basically him versus the rest of the rabbis arguing over a point of law. So it's called the oven of Aknai because the point of Jewish law is whether a particular oven can be ritually purified or not. So as it says here, apropos the topic of verbal mystery, well, we learned in a Mishnah going in kalim, which is vessels, if one cut an earthenware oven sideways into segments and place sand between every segment, Rabbi Eliezer says it's ritually pure. By the way, this is kind of a bit like how you make a pizza oven. So I've got a pizza oven in my garden, and when I bought this house, I asked my friend who's a rabbi, can I kosher it? And he said it's the oven of Aknai, so it depends if you believe Rabbi Eliezer or the other rabbis. So anyway, because of this, it's a legal status that is not that of a complete vessel, and therefore it's not susceptible to ritual impurity. And the rabbis deem it ritually impure, as it's functionally a complete oven. So there's a big, what we call a machloket, a disagreement between the rabbis. And this is known as the oven of Aknai. The Gemara asks, what's the relevance of Aknai, a snake in this context? Rabbi Yehuda said, that Shmuel said, it's characterized in the manner due to the fact the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like the snake, which often forms a coil when at rest is deemed impure. Okay, I'm not going to go into that because we don't have time. The sages, who are the rabbis, taught. So we call these Mishnaic and rabbis down the line. We call them sages or chazal, which is an abbreviation of the sages of blessed memory. They taught on that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all the possible answers in the world to support his opinion. He gave every single reason. He brought all the proof texts to show why it was pure, why it was allowed. But the rabbis did not accept his explanations. After failing to convince the rabbis using halakha logic, he said to him, if the halakha is in accordance with me, this carob tree will prove it. Right? Carob trees crop up a lot in the Talmud. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits. It's a measurement, cubits, and some say 400. We're not sure which, because it's definitely history. The rabbi said to him, listen, you don't prove halakha, the Jewish law, from what a carob tree does, right? Rabbi Eliezer then says, okay, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. And the water in the stream turned backwards and began flowing in the opposite direction. And they said to him, listen, we don't follow halakha by what a stream does, right? It's not how it works. So Rabbi Eliezer says to them, okay, if the halakha is on my side, then the walls of this study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall leaned inwards and began to fall. Rabbi Yoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what's it got to do with you, walls? The walls did not fall because of deference to Rabbi Yoshua. So these are all kind of miracle men, right? But they did not straighten because of deference to them. They remained, and they still remain leaning, maybe to this day. So Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a bat kol, a divine voice, or a voice from heaven emerged and said, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place? Every time he says halakha, it's true. I'm God, I'm telling you, I'm a voice from heaven. Well, it's not clear if it's God, but it's a voice from heaven. Rabbi Yeshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, and this is like, just hold on to your seats here. It is not in heaven. This is a quote, Deuteronomy 30:12. Go and look it up. Context, no context. I can't remember the context, but I've looked at it in the past. There's no reason to understand it in this way. What's the relevance of this phrase? It is not in heaven. Rabbi Yeremiah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice. As you've already written it, you already gave us the Torah, right? And it says in the Torah, after a majority to incline, Exodus 23:2. right? You follow the majority. That's how you make decisions. And since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halacha, the law, is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah,
so, the Torah is not in heaven. It's not, right? This is the ultimate triumph of the rabbis. They are, not only do they have the authority to continue to be the leaders of Judaism, they are the real authentic Judaism, but they override a heavenly voice, a divine voice. They're the majority view of the rabbis. That's how you decide what the law is, not if God gets involved.
It's so interesting because this does, I think, tie into Paul. And not directly, but this idea. The reason why I mention this, and they are not connected in any way. I'm saying that it's a related issue because if you look at the Pseudo-Clementine literature, you find this issue between Peter and Paul, and Peter is literally telling Paul, your visions, the voices, the noises from heaven, like they're probably demonic or evil, like you can't trust them, you can't believe them. And is making an excuse for everything Paul's claiming is true. And I just read Deuteronomy 30, verse 12 that you had up.
Yeah.
And just ripping it out of context, it says, it is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could argue that you could see why there's an argument to be made that that's relevant, but maybe not. But I think it's different to the situation with Peter and Paul because Peter's saying you're a madman and you're just either making this stuff up or you have devils in you. Right? These rabbis are saying we heard God's voice. We heard you. We that's not how it works. We don't listen to God when it comes to this. He's given it to us to do. And just to reading the next bit, the Gemara relates years after Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet turns up the whole time and like very frequently. Some brilliant stories with him. So, and says to him, "What did the Holy One, blessed be He, do at that time when Rabbi Yeshua issued this declaration?" And Elijah the prophet says to him, "The Holy One, blessed be He, smiled and said, 'My children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me.'" So God is kind of like, he's pleased about it. He's like, these guys, I gave them this stuff. They know what they're doing. They're running with it. You know, well done, kids.
This is a very interesting point. Like God's testing them in a way. Like you could take it as like, no matter what, even if God himself tries to change things, they are being consistent with not changing it. And while that's funny and cool, but in reality, that's kind of a scary thing unless you're going to reinterpret what a lot of things mean in modern context. Because if, as you well know, there's a lot of very outdated ideas, slavery, you name it, in the Torah that we obviously don't practice. Yeah.
And maybe this is a good point to finish on. And I've seen this currently on the MythVision Facebook group. There's like a discussion going on and where someone is kind of arguing from a Jewish traditional perspective, someone's arguing from a historical perspective. From a Jewish perspective, it almost doesn't matter what it says. The plain reading of the Torah almost doesn't matter. You're not supposed to read it like that. We are taught that's not how you. First of all, you have to read Torah with a commentary, usually at Rashi or something like that, is a medieval commentator, and you need to understand it through the lens of the rabbis because it was all given together. Right, we've given you the plain text and we're giving you the oral tradition. You can't understand the plain text without the oral tradition. That's why, and the Sadducees rejected the oral tradition. That's why they got it wrong, according to the rabbis and contemporary Judaism. Like pretty much all forms of even Reform Judaism is rabbinical. You know, like all forms of. There's a very, very small Karaite Jewish community left in the world who were kind of like. 8th century onwards Sadducees, but sort of picked up some of their ideas. But mostly this is how Jews understand the Torah, right? So this idea of like, well, an eye for an eye, that's never meant an eye for an eye. It doesn't mean literally an eye for an eye. It's about monetary compensation. If you break my property, you have to pay me for it. That's what it means. Like, yeah, you didn't see the oral law. Well, don't be silly. So this is one of the reasons why Jews and Christians are reading completely different texts when we look at the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, because we've got, we're looking at it through the lens of the rabbis, and the rabbinic Jewish belief is that this is the tradition that goes all the way back to Moses, received from God, and then passed down, and they don't get it. The Christians don't get it. The Karaites don't get it. The Sadducees don't get it. The Essenes don't get it, although they seem to have got it to some degree. The Samaritans don't get it. None of these groups get it. None of the modern Christian groups get it. Muslims who are reading the Torah don't get it. Even though there's a lot of Talmud and Midrash in the Quran, but that's a whole other conversation. It's all the same thing. You can't differentiate between the 5 books of Moses or the Tanakh and the oral law. Right. Yes, technically the Torah is like the most important source and it's the overriding authority. But if you're not understanding it through the rabbinic lens, you're not understanding it.
Yeah, it's an interesting whole setup, the way they did this. It definitely divorces itself from its surroundings. I could tell you that. And like, we need to go directly through them. Well, it's a different
era. It's like it's a different religion. One of the scholars I highly recommend, Daniel Boyarin, who's a rabbinic scholar. He has a book called, I think it's Beyond Borderlines or Borderlines, and he shows how Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism came up together. They're like sister religions, and Rabbinic Judaism, from an internal perspective, is the natural continuation of what was there before. It just is what was, right? It just is. But from an academic and historical perspective, it's a different religion, that's related to, that comes out of first century or perhaps first century CE or first century or second century BCE, maybe starts around the time of the Hasmoneans. And we can go into that a bit more another time as well, tying it all together, because you can literally tie it together. But just reading the text, it feels different and it sounds different, right? The language, the way people talk is different. The way we understand the laws are different. Yeah.
This has been a really interesting. I know we're going to take a deep dive into this connection between Josephus's work on Vespasian and what happened with one of the rabbis and stuff, and the way that it is. There seems to be a big connection that you caught your eye on. We'll dive deep into that next time. Ladies and gentlemen, check out the upcoming video that we're going to do. You're not going to want to miss it. This has been a great little introduction to the kind of ideas you're going to get when you get into the Talmud, the Mishnah, Tosefta, you name it, all the Jewish writings, and why we could create a religion out of something that, you have to ask yourself, what do you do? No more sacrifice, no more temple, no more. And here they're already creating very cleverly a whole nother way of practicing their ancient tradition without practicing some of their ancient tradition. And thank you, Dan Jacobs. Any final words you'd like to say to the audience before we go?
Check out all the links. There's lots that I didn't go through that's really cool stuff in there. And it's great. And join the Patreon, because I joined it a while ago and it's brilliant. It's just such great content that you don't get on YouTube. You don't get to see everything. And some of it you get to see early. So join the Patreon. And, we are MythVision.
Yes, we are. Never forget that. We are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon, not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.